Well, good morning. I'm happy to be with you this morning and have this opportunity to open the Scripture together. We've been walking through the book of Revelation, and I had a brief thought about continuing on in the series until I started reading Revelation chapter 12, and it's talking about a pregnant woman and a great dragon with all these heads and eyes and horns, and I said, no, I'll leave that to Pastor Brent. So we're going to be in Daniel. The book of Daniel this morning, and not Daniel chapter 7 or any of those real challenging visions. We want to go into the book of Daniel and look at a story from Daniel chapter 3. A story that many of us are very familiar with. How many of you from childhood heard the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Okay, we've probably all heard that from a young age, very familiar with that, about these three men in the fiery furnace. But Daniel 3 really isn't a story about the fiery furnace. It's about faithful worship. And the fiery furnace was simply the place where their faith was tested. And this chapter really isn't a story about how do we survive the fire in our life, but it's about three men who had already decided long before they ever stood before the opening to the fiery furnace that they would be faithful to God. They had made this decision long before they knew what the test was going to be or how the story was going to end. Because before there was ever a miracle, these three men had already made a decision. And before the fourth man was ever seen in the fire, there were three men who had already decided that their God was worthy of worship, even if worshiping Him cost them everything. And so this chapter that we're going to look at this morning in Daniel chapter 3 raises a question that every generation of believer must answer, and we must answer that today. And the question is this: will I trust and be faithful to God only when He comes through for me, or will I be faithful to Him even when I don't know how the end is going to work out? And this is a very important question for us because, as we'll see in Daniel chapter 3 today, God is glorified as His people faithfully live out their faith in Him. So let's read this chapter together. Even though we're very familiar with the story, I want to read it together this morning. And due to time, we won't obviously have the time to unpack from verses 1 to verse 30, so we'll focus our attention more on the second half of the chapter. But let's read the chapter together for the context. Follow with me as I read Daniel chapter 3. It says this: King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits, or about 90 feet, and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not, you shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments. And they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire?" They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb and their houses laid in ruin, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. What a story that many of us are familiar with. But as we look at this passage, I want us to we're going to start examining a little bit more in detail, starting in verse 14 and 15, where Nebuchadnezzar lays down a challenge for these 3 men. Of course, he had expected, as he was the conquering king, the ruling king, he had expected that everyone was going to fall in line, and that all of these, and we read many times the whole list of the governors and satraps and prefects and all of those people, he expected that everyone was going to fall in line along with him. And when these 3 men didn't, we see in verse 13 that Nebuchadnezzar was furious. It says, in a furious rage, he commanded them to be brought. And Nebuchadnezzar, in his arrogance, thinking that he was the man who was superior not only to men, the king that was not only superior to kings, but he was superior even to other gods, and expected that people would treat him as such. And so he lays down this challenge again to these three men and commands that they fall down and lays out the punishment of what is going to happen if they don't. But then he issues a challenge and a declaration at the end of verse 15 when he said, "Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" Now, humanly speaking, we can understand a little bit where Nebuchadnezzar was coming from. Because this God that these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were worshiping, in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, Nebuchadnezzar had already proved his superiority to this God. How so? Well, he had gone to Judah. He had invaded the country of Judah. He had decimated and destroyed Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. He had even gone into the temple, desecrated the temple, taken articles of gold and silver out of the temple and brought it back to his palace and his temple in Babylon. And in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, he had done all this, and the God of the Jews was powerless to stop him. So you can see in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar why he would imagine and why he would ask this question: who is this God who's going to save you out of my hand? Because this God already didn't save you out of my hand. And so implicit in this question that Nebuchadnezzar asks really is the accusation that these Jewish men are foolish to stand up against him, to oppose him. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego understood that what had happened in Judah and in Jerusalem, they understood that was in the context of God's judgment on Israel for their faithlessness toward him. And these three men had already chosen the path of faith, that they would faithfully serve God even in the times when he seemed absent. Because here Nebuchadnezzar could question whether this God, A, either existed or had any power to rescue since he hadn't showed up in the past. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had faith in their God, and they chose to live faithfully and to follow him faithfully. And we see that in verses 16 to 18. Nebuchadnezzar issues a challenge, but Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have a response of faith. They knew who Yahweh their God is. They put their trust in him, and they lived out their faith in a time and a moment of crisis. Now, what's interesting about these verses, the first thing that we see is that their faith in God produced a calm assurance, even though they had absolutely no control of what was going on in their lives. Look at verse 16 and 17. And this passage, as you look at it, the verse is it can be a little bit confusing and a little bit difficult to translate. But there's one commentator who I like the way that he translated this, or he sees it. He said this: he prefers to see these verses as saying this: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered to the king and said, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter of if our God whom we serve is able to deliver you." In other words, we don't have to think or discuss or debate this question of if our God is able. In fact, then they give the assertion, he will deliver us from your hands. Now, I think we should understand this. What they're saying here is not an arrogant statement, but it's a confident statement. Now, how could they be so confident? Standing face to face with a king who had just destroyed their nation and deported them to Babylon, how could they stand so confidently? Well, it's because they knew who their God was. They knew God's character, they knew God's word, and their faith in God came from past situations where God had already showed his faithfulness. You see, Nebuchadnezzar wasn't the first king to ask this question, who is this God? If you think back with me to Pharaoh in the story of Exodus, In Exodus chapter 5 and verse 1, when Moses goes in at God's command and says to Pharaoh, this is what the Yahweh, the God of Israel, says, let my people go. And Pharaoh responds by saying, who is Yahweh that I should obey him? He said, I do not know Yahweh, and I will not let the people go. So Pharaoh issues a very similar question to what Nebuchadnezzar issues here. Who is this God? And what makes you think that I need to listen to him? Or that I'm in any way inferior to him? But what was God's response to Pharaoh? God sent the 10 plagues that decimated the land of Egypt, and each one of those plagues was specifically targeted at an Egyptian god in the pantheon of gods. And God demonstrated his superiority. And what's interesting is in Exodus chapter 9 and verse 14, God says very clearly and very explicitly to Pharaoh, he says, I will send all my plagues on you yourself and on your servants and on your people so that you may know that there is none like me in all the earth. Pharaoh asked the question, who is Yahweh? And Yahweh said, let me show you. Because he is the one who is the King of all kings. There's other stories in the Old Testament. I think of Jehoshaphat in 2 Chronicles 20 when this great army came up against him from the south. And people brought word to him that this army has come against them, and he goes and he prays. And in 2 Chronicles 20, he says this, Yahweh, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you. We have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We do not know what to do, but our eyes are on you. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego undoubtedly knew these stories. They knew the story of what happened when Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, came to besiege Jerusalem. We read about this in 2 Kings 18 and 19. And Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, which was the first really world power on the scene even before Babylon. And Sennacherib comes and he sends his messenger to say to the people of Israel, don't listen to Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the king of Judah at that time. He said, don't let Hezekiah deceive you. Don't let him persuade you to trust in Yahweh. Don't listen to Hezekiah because he's misleading you. And then he says this, who among all the gods of the lands have delivered their lands out of my hand? That Yahweh should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand. Again, a very similar question to what Nebuchadnezzar poses. Who is this God? And again, Hezekiah goes and he lays this letter before the Lord and he prays. He says, Yahweh, God of Israel, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, deliver us from his hand so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Yahweh, are God. So all of these stories of how God had worked miraculously and providentially in the past, this was in the mind of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They knew who their God was. They had heard of how he had acted in the past. But they also had seen his faithfulness in a very close and personal way in their own lives. If we were to go back and read Daniel chapter 1, we would see how when Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego were among those who were deported to Babylon, and they were conscripted into the king's service. And the king said, okay, you're going to eat this meat and you're going to drink this wine. And they refused because they said, we are not going to eat and drink these things that have been offered to other gods. And they prayed, and they proposed a solution that God brought about and enabled them not to defile themselves. And then in chapter 2, we see when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, And he says to all of his wise men and his magicians, okay, I want you not only to tell me the interpretation of this dream, I want you to tell me what the dream is. And they all responded that said, no king has ever asked this of any man, and no man could ever do this. This is only something that the gods could do. And so the king decided to put them to death, and Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego prayed to God, and God revealed that dream and its interpretation to Daniel. And Daniel went in and told the king, and they were spared. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their faith was rooted in who God was and how they had heard of him acting in the past and how they had seen him personally intervene in their own lives. And God's faithfulness provided a solid foundation for them to live out their faith by being faithful to God in their present circumstance. Look at what they say in verse 17. Our God, whom we serve, they specify that they are continuing to believe, to trust, to serve this God, even the one who has brought them to the place where they were. He said, our God whom we are able to serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. One of the commentators that I was reading said this. He said, these men were unsure of God's circumstantial will. That is, whether or not they would escape. But they were sure of God's revealed will when God said, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not bow down or worship idols. So although they didn't know what God's will for them was, how he was going to deliver them in this situation, they knew what he had clearly said, and they chose to live out their faith by being faithful to what God had revealed. They humbly accepted the fact that God does not always choose to intervene miraculously in human circumstances, even in the circumstances of his own servants. And really, this is the essence of true faith. Not just an intellectual belief in historical facts, but a belief that produces a response of faithfulness to God, of ongoing trust and reliance on him, especially when faced with our own inability to control the outcomes. You see, it's easy to have faith when we can have a hand in things, right? When we can work, when we can kind of manipulate or try to set things up, and we say, okay, yeah, I'm going to do this, and I trust that God will kind of come along and give the thumbs up to this plan. But when we are completely, as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were, completely out of control, completely incapable of doing anything, that is when faith is really seen and really tested. And faith that stems from God's faithfulness, from knowing it through his word, from experiencing it in our own lives, faith that stems from God's faithfulness produces in us a willingness to humbly submit to this God, however he chooses to act to glorify himself. So, as a means of application for us, what, if you will, fiery furnace are you standing in front of in your life right now? And how can God's past faithfulness, what you have heard of him or how you have seen him work in your own life, how can that inform and help you in the midst of your current situation? As you stare down a difficult situation, how can God's faithfulness encourage and help you to remain faithful to him? You see, all throughout the Old Testament, Israel was exhorted not to forget the works of God. And as we read through the Old Testament, we constantly see them setting up pillars and stones and altars and memorials so that they would not forget. And Scripture tells us that when they did forget, it oftentimes led them into disobedience. Hold your finger here and look with me at Psalm chapter 78. Psalm chapter 78, verses 9 to 11. This is a psalm that recounts the history of the people of Israel. And in verses 9 through 11, the psalmist writes this: "The Ephraimites, armed with the bow, turned back on the day of battle." Now you might think, well, if I went into battle with a bow today, I'd probably turn and run anyway. Right? But in this time, the bow was one of the more advanced weaponry. And so the idea is that these Ephraimites, these people of Ephraim, or one of the tribes of Israel, as they were going into battle and had what seemed like a physical or a technological advantage, but they turned back on the day of battle. Now, why would that be? Look at what it says in verse 10 and 11. "They did not keep God's covenant, but refused to walk according to his law. They forgot his works and the wonders that he had shown him." It is important for us as we face trials and difficulties, as our faith is tested, to remember the faithfulness of God. Because that faithfulness becomes the foundation on which we place our faith in him. But what's interesting is we continue through this passage and we get down to verses 19 to 23. The narrator of this chapter gives us a very stark contrast between the faith and the character of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the character of Nebuchadnezzar. And we see in verses 19 to 23 that Nebuchadnezzar's true colors once again come shining through. In verse 19 we read, "Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego." Have you ever watched somebody get mad? I mean, mad in the sense where you literally see it come across their face. And the whole expression of their face just changes. This is what happens with Nebuchadnezzar. He was already upset. In fact, in verse 13, it says that Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded for these three to be brought. And now he goes from a furious rage to being filled with fury in verse 19. But what happens when Nebuchadnezzar gets upset? First of all, we've already talked about the fact that he was arrogant, that he had thought himself superior to men, to kings, and even to gods. And we saw that in verse 15. But now we see in these verses, Nebuchadnezzar starts furiously grasping for control. When his authority is challenged, he gets angry and he starts furiously grasping for control. Look at verse 19. It just shows the outrageous nature of his anger. He was filled with fury, the expression of his face was changed, and he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Oftentimes, when we sense that we are losing control of a situation, what do we try to do? We try to find a way to grasp and to reestablish and regain our control in a situation. And Nebuchadnezzar does the same thing here. And this isn't the first time. We see back in chapter 2 that the king was angry and furious when his wise men couldn't produce both the dream and the interpretation. This is a character issue with Nebuchadnezzar. And then, as often happens when we try to grasp for control, like Nebuchadnezzar does here in verse 20, down through the end of verse 23, he's going to attempt to flex his muscle to prove that he's in control, or he was going to either reestablish his control or destroy those who defied his control. And so, at the end of verse 19, it says he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Now, whether this is a literal 7 times, okay, the furnace is 200 degrees, let's bump it up to 1,400, or whether this is kind of a hyperbole, a metaphor basically saying Because often 7 is pictured in the Old Testament as the number of completion. And so he's going to heat this thing as hot as it could possibly be heated, way over the established limit. And not only does he heat the furnace up, but he's going to choose, look at what he says in verse 20. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You see how he's trying to flex his muscle. So not only does he threaten them with the furnace, but now this furnace is going to be heated excessively. And not only is he going to take these men and bind them, but he's going to pick the biggest, the strongest, the most intimidating soldiers in his army to do the job. You see what he's trying to do? He's trying to reestablish this control. But as is often the case with anger, Nebuchadnezzar's actions in anger ended up destroying those around him, but not the ones he was trying to destroy. And many times for us, when we are losing control and we try to react in anger to reestablish our control, we end up causing destruction, just like we see Nebuchadnezzar do. And so this chapter lays out the contrast of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had a very calm and confident faith in God, even in the absence of any control over their life. And that's contrasted with Nebuchadnezzar, who thought he was in control and furiously tried to keep or regain the control that he thought that he had. So what can we learn from this? Well, when we're facing a challenge that seems hopeless, and it seems that any control we tried to establish is slipping away, who does our character more reflect? Is it reflective of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had a calm and steady confidence in God? Or does it reflect the flailings of an arrogant king who desperately tried to do everything that he could to regain the control of his own life? And what's beautiful in this is it is at this point, even when everything seems desperate and hopeless, that God acts miraculously to display his glory. He steps in to show who he is. He's going to respond to Nebuchadnezzar's question of who is this God? And we see this in verses 24 to 27. Because though Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were bound, and bound in all of this elaborate clothing that you would think normally would be quite flammable. But yet, as they go into the fire, they went in bound against their will. But yet Nebuchadnezzar said, now I see 4, and they're walking around free and unharmed. And God, in a miraculous way, sends one who Nebuchadnezzar describes as being like a son of the gods to be with them in the fire, to protect them. And when they come out, we see in verse 27, all of these officials who had gathered saw that the fire had no power over the bodies of their men. And I love the way, just the completeness of the description of God's protection and provision of these men. The fire had no power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed. You think of when you get close to a fire, what's the first thing to go? Right? It's the hair on the back of the hands or on the arm. But it says the hair of their head was not singed. Their cloaks were not harmed. And no smell of fire had come on them. Now, how amazing is that? If you have a fire pit in your backyard and you ever like to sit out in the summer or in the fall roasting marshmallows or something like that, you know what it is to have the smell of fire on you. In fact, when you come back, anywhere you sit, if you sit on the couch is going to have the smell of fire on. So you can just see how God, through the narrator here, just gives the complete picture of how God had providentially stepped in and delivered these people. And Nebuchadnezzar is forced now to respond by praising God and by honoring his servants. Look at what he says in verse 28. I think this is so amazing. He blesses God, this same God that he asked earlier, who is this God who you think will deliver you from my hand? Now he says, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. What brought Nebuchadnezzar to bless and to praise, to honor God? It was the faithfulness of God's servants. And as we said at the beginning, God is glorified when his people faithfully live out their faith in him. And Nebuchadnezzar came to declare at the end of verse 29, there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. But as we think about this story, and we know this story, we love this story, but we also recognize that both practically and biblically, each step of the story doesn't always happen the way that we would like. We can walk through, or we can be standing in front of a fiery furnace, and we have no guarantee that God will miraculously intervene in our lives. Just like Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego didn't know for sure how it would turn out. They even said, but even if not, and many of us know practically what that's like. Many of us have wept at a funeral or grieved over a lost relationship that we have prayed over. And even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, before they ever got to the point where they experienced God's miraculous deliverance in their lives in chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3, they lived through the destruction of their hometown of Jerusalem, the desecration of the temple, and even the death of their family and friends. And when we look in the book of Hebrews chapter 11, we read something very interesting. Turn with me, if you will, to Hebrews. Because as we get to verse 32, the writer of Hebrews is giving all of these examples of those who lived by faith and miraculous things that happened. And in verse 32, he wants to continue, but he realizes he can't just keep talking at length about all of these things. And he says, what more shall I say? The time would fail me to tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises. See if these sound familiar. Stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. A lot of miraculous things that were happening. But look at the middle of verse 35. Others were tortured, refusing to accept release so that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed with the sword. Now, what sets them apart? It doesn't mean that one group had more or greater faith than the other, because look at what verse 39 says. It says, these were all commended for their faith. So faith doesn't guarantee us the results that we want in every step of life. That's what we call the prosperity gospel. But it allows us to humbly live out our faith and confidence in God as we fix our eyes on Jesus, the founder and the perfecter of our faith. So whether or not we get what we want in our current situation, God can still be glorified as we faithfully live out our faith in Him, demonstrating our reliance on God and our commitment to Him. So the question for us today is, when we are facing our own fiery furnace, whatever that might look like, how will we choose to live out our faith in order to make God's glory visible to those around us? You see, it wasn't just Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that give us this example. Jesus himself showed us the example of this same thing. A calm assurance in his Father's goodness and care for him. When he was in the garden and he prayed, "Father, if there is any way, let this cup pass from me." But how did he finish his prayer? He said, "But not my will, but yours be done." Jesus had a calm assurance in his Father's goodness, in his Father's care for him, and he was humbly committed to faithfully fulfill what God had given him to do and submit himself to his Father's will.